I want you to imagine that you're at a party, a dinner party, and it's a party you want to go to, because we've all been to parties we didn't want to go to, we had to go to. This is a party you want to go to, and at the party, there's some people that you know, and then there's a pretty good handful of people you don't know, and as the party progresses, you kind of check in with your folks, and you're kind of milling around, and you find yourself talking to this guy that you didn't know, and you find out his name is Tom. And as you're talking to Tom, it kind of strikes you that he's pretty funny, and he seems like a nice guy, and you kind of start to make an assumption that he's witty, and he's just an interesting person, and as you keep talking to him, you find out he's a pediatrician. And so you kind of make another couple of assumptions. You think, well, he must be pretty smart. I mean, you got to be smart to be a doctor. And he's devoted his life to helping sick kids. So he probably is, a caring person. And you keep talking to him over time and after a while. And then you kind of realize he keeps turning the conversation back to you. He keeps asking about you and where you do and where you live and places you've gone. And he's just really interested in you. And it kind of, just kind of leaves you with this place where, man, it seems like this is a really good guy. I'd like to be friends with this guy. I'd like to know this guy better and hang out with this guy. Well, the party ends. And as you're walking out, you find yourself walking out to the car at the same time your friend Rick is walking out. And you tell him, hey, man, I met this guy. He's a pediatrician, and we need to all grab lunch or go play golf or something. I think you'd really like him. And Rick's face just changes all of a sudden. He goes, you mean Tom, the pediatrician? Well, yeah, do you know him? I just spent most of the night talking to him. He's like, it's Tom, the ex-pediatrician, actually. Oh, why? He got caught selling drugs illegally. Oh, he seemed like such a nice guy. I mean, and he's taking care of kids and all the other stuff. And he goes, well, actually, it's ironic you say that. He's in the middle of a really nasty court battle over custody of his kids because his anger issues, the court ruled he couldn't even see his kids for a while. And all of a sudden, this image that you had of Tom is just shattered. I mean, it was built and you thought, this is a good guy, this is a nice guy, this is somebody I could be friends with, this is somebody I want to hang out with. And now all of a sudden, you're kind of like, oh, wow. All my assumptions and all my feelings, I was really kind of willing to trust this guy. And now all of a sudden, I'm not. And that's what trust is, right? We have to make a mental picture of people. We have to make a mental picture of a situation and try to decide, should I trust this person or not? And it gets difficult because so many times our mental picture is inaccurate. We don't know enough, or we kind of go based on our feelings, or we make some assumptions, and it puts us in a kind of a dangerous place, so to speak. How do you know who to trust and who not to trust? I'll tell you one thing. There is a group that you should never trust, ever. Like, you should never trust them. Doesn't matter how long you've been around them. Doesn't matter how long you've been connected to them. You should never trust them. You know who it is? Trees. You know why? Because they're all shady. Oh, yeah. Or they're Dallas Cowboys fans. I don't know. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. But it's funny. We get burned by something. A lot of times we hesitate to trust. We don't want to trust it, and we feel like we can never trust. It gets more complicated, though. Because not only do we have to create this mental picture, even when we've known someone a long time, it gets a little tricky because the reality is there is the person and then there's the person in our head. So for example, I've been married to my wife, Donna, for 30 years, a little over 30 years. And I think we have a pretty healthy, strong marriage. But the reality is I have two wives. I don't know if you know this. I have the wife, Donna, that lives in my head, and I have the wife, Donna, that lives in real life. And they're not the same all the time. Now, we know each other really well, and we trust each other pretty good. But every once in a while, the wife Donna in my head and the wife Donna in real life, they're not on the same page. I'll give you an example. Every time I have an argument with my wife Donna in my head, you know who wins? I do. Every time. Every time. And she actually apologizes and she says, you were right, and I don't know how I could ever think that way. And I mean, you're just, I'm so lucky to be married to you. That's my wife Donna in my head. My wife Donna in real life, when we argue, let's just say it's good we don't argue that often because I never win. I never win. And it's a long-term relationship. We know each other. We still make assumptions. We still sometimes struggle with how to trust. And my guess is you're in the same boat. Whether it's somebody you just met or somebody you've known a long time, trust isn't easy. It's complicated. It's slippery. And just when we think we got it figured out, things can shift on us. And that exact same principle of the person in your head and the person in real life applies to your relationship with God. And here's how that works. So many people that I know are upset, hurt, frustrated, disappointed with God because God didn't do something that they expected him to do. Now, the reality is God never said he would do it. God never promised that. And that's not necessarily something about God's character that we should count on. But in our mind and in our assumptions and in our feelings, we felt like God should do that for me. Or just the opposite, that God should not have let something happen, even though, again, he never promised he would do that, even though he never said that wouldn't happen. We just assumed, and we feel like it shouldn't, and we assume that it shouldn't. And what happens is the God in our head doesn't behave like the real God, and we feel like we can't trust him. And there's a really, really fundamental problem with all of that. I get it, because I have the feelings, I have the expectations, I have the assumptions too. But here's the fundamental problem with that when it comes to God or anybody else. You can't base your trust on what you assume or what you feel. It's not that those things don't matter, but your trust has to be based on what you know. And here's what I've found when it comes to God. The more I know him, not what everybody else says about him, not what I assume he should be doing or how I think he should be acting, but the more I actually know him, not because somebody said this, not because it happened for other people, the more I know God, the more I trust him. Because the more I get to know him, I see how good he is, how sincere and deep his love is, and it makes me trust him even more because I know him. And I don't get disappointed as much because it's not based on my assumption or my feeling about what God should be or should do. It's based on who he actually is. It works that way in our relationship with God, and it works that way in our relationship with people. When we know them, it helps us understand and decide how we should trust them or how much we should trust them. See, last week we talked about this idea that we have to know, and that is one of the important 5 bonds in any relationship. There are 5 bonds that if we keep healthy, gives us a chance to win at our relationships. And we talked about the idea of knowing someone. And this week we're talking about the idea of trusting someone. And the reason trust is so important, and I know when I say this, you're gonna go like, oh yeah, but building trust builds your relationships. When you build up trust, it makes the relationship stronger, it makes the relationship healthier, it makes the relationship more enjoyable for everybody. So you have to build up trust. Question is, how? Or maybe even more important than how do I rebuild trust or rebuild relationship where my trust kind of got broken, where maybe I felt a little let down, or maybe I felt like things went sideways and it was somebody else's fault and I got hurt and I got hurt deeply. And what do you do with that? How do you win at that kind of relationship? Trust is so, so important. And we're going to spend a few moments today talking about that and what it looks like to trust. And here's the thing. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. One of the reasons I love the Bible, there's many, many reasons why I love reading the Bible, but one of the reasons I love reading the Bible, and one of the reasons you can trust the Bible, because the Bible tells it like it is. So for example, when you read the Bible, there's accounts of people doing great, loving, and sacrificial things. There's also accounts of people failing and messing up relationships and doing it wrong. It doesn't try to gloss it over. What it does is it shows us how God's at work in both of those kinds of situations. And that's one of the reasons you can trust it. It's real, just like your life is real. One of the things we find in the Bible, when we start to look, is in Acts chapter 15. If you've got a Bible or the app you want to follow along, we meet 3 men in Acts chapter 15. And their names are Paul and Barnabas and Mark, or John Mark as he goes by sometimes. And these 3 men, they came to a place where they were all having to make decisions about trust, about trusting each other, and about responding to what they felt like was a broken trust. And so I think it's really helpful for us. But before we dive in, I want to kind of give you a sketch of what had happened and how we got to that point in Acts 15. Because in Acts 15, it kind of picks up as if you knew the story already, because it has been told in the prior portion of the book. And here's the quick version of that story. Paul and Barnabas had been friends for a long time. But before they ever became friends, something really powerful happened. They, as they lived their daily lives, they saw Jesus. They heard about Jesus. They saw him healing. They saw him doing his thing. They saw and heard about the trial. They knew that he got arrested. They most likely, at least one of them most likely, saw Jesus hanging on a cross and being executed. And all of those things had a profound impact on them. But the thing that changed their life, and for so many of you, it's the thing that has changed your life, they learned that he rose from the dead. He's the only one that had ever done that. A lot of people have died. A lot of people have been executed. A lot of people have done good things. A lot of people have made a lot of friends and taught really well and been an interesting person and somebody that's really loving. A lot of people have done all those things. But nobody had done that. Because up until that point in time, you know what dead people did? They stayed dead. Jesus was dead and he came back to life, and it changed their life because they realized it gave them a new life with God through Christ. Their sins were forgiven and their life was changed, and they could not help but live a different life and tell other people about what had happened. And so these two guys find themselves in the same church. They're in the same church. It's called the church at Antioch, and it's just like this church. A church is not a building. A church is not people. It's not a name or an institution or a brand. It's a group of people, just like you, that are following Jesus together. That's what the church is. And this church, where Paul and Barnabas were, prayed with each other, talked with each other, and they all came to the same realization that Paul and Barnabas need to be sent out. And not in a bad way, not because they'd done anything wrong, but there was a calling on their life from God that they needed to go and tell other people what Jesus had done and why he had made a difference in their life. And so they go through this process of figuring it out, of where are we going to go and what are we going to do, and they start making plans and preparations, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, Barnabas says, hey, we should take my cousin Mark along with us. Paul says, great, let's do that. And off they go. Now, my guess is, I don't know if this is true, my guess is they probably had some romantic notions, just like we all do. When we go on a big adventure, we make a big change. This is going to be so great. I'm going to get this new job, and it's going to be wonderful. I'm going to start this new relationship, and everything's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be fun. It's a great adventure. We're going to go travel. We're going to do, and I'm sure they started out like that. After they got into the trip, though, reality kind of hit them. Because in some places, the people were pretty nasty. And in some places, the people didn't want to hear what they had to say. And somewhere along the way, after they had done this a few times and been thrown out of town a couple of times, Mark says, hey guys, this isn't for me. I'm not doing this. I'm going home. I can't do this anymore. And he left. And Paul and Barnabas, they felt like, no, this is what God's called us to. We have to keep going. We have to keep doing this. No matter how hard it gets, we've got to keep going. And they did, and they finished their trip. They went to all the places they planned to go. They told people whether they wanted to hear it or not about who Jesus was and what Jesus had done. And then finally, they came back home. And as they were back home, they kind of rested for a while. And it was about a year later, Barnabas tells Paul, hey, Paul, remember all those places we went, all those people we saw? We need to go back and check on them. And maybe we want to try going to some new places. Paul says, yeah, sure. And Barnabas says, and let's take Mark along again. And that was the flashpoint. Look at Acts chapter 15, verse 36. He says, let's take Mark again. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. And Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and left. Commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord, he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And it just, you know this, but this just shows how powerful trust is. Trust brings either strong dedication, and broken trust brings sharp dispute. And that's exactly what happened in this situation. It says there was a sharp dispute among them. That's kind of a nice, clean way of saying they weren't having it. They weren't having each other. They didn't like the idea. They didn't like the other one that was bringing up the idea. And they were kind of like drawing a line in the sand. Well, if you, then I'm, no, not. We're not doing that. I'm not going to go then. I'm going to, it was a very sharp dispute. And here's what's fascinating to me. The Bible doesn't say whose fault it was. It doesn't say this was Paul's fault or that this was Barnabas' fault. And it's easy to kind of see if you can kind of dial back a little bit and look at the big picture and wonder, well, I mean, maybe Paul was right. He quit. He quit on him. Nobody wants a quitter. Maybe Barnabas was right. It was his cousin. He knew him really well. And he was saying, no, we can trust him now. He's changed. He's different. We need to bring him along again. Or maybe it was Paul's fault. Paul was the king of second chances, right? He got the biggest second chance of all. And it's like, you won't give this guy a second chance? Really? Or maybe Barnabas was blinded by his family ties. Because of family, he couldn't give up on him, even though maybe everybody else said, yeah, that's not a good idea. We don't know. We don't know whose fault it was, but ironically, and I think in a really wonderful way, God took even this sharp disagreement among these leaders in the church, among these people that were trying to help others know and follow Jesus, And instead of sending out one team, he sent out two. Instead of sending out two people, he sent out four. So God still got the things God wanted done. But there was this disagreement, this broken trust. And you know this. Trust is so important in a relationship. I mean, trust is like gas in a car, right? You cannot, if your car and there's no gas in it, or, well, you electric people, no charge in it, I mean, it's not going anywhere, right? You can look at the car and love it because it's so pretty and it's so cool and it's got all these wonderful features and you can have people come with you to sit in the car and you can enjoy the seats and you can play with all the dials, but if it doesn't have any fuel, it's not going anywhere. Every single one of your relationships is the same way. If it doesn't have any trust, or if that trust is broken, it's not going anywhere. It's not. It doesn't have what it needs to move forward. And I think you probably know that because you've had many relationships in your lives and you've gone through this process, whether you use these labels or you use different labels or whatever it might be. You've realized, like, the people that I trust, that's the relationships that mean the most. That's the relationships that move forward the most. That's also the relationships that have the potential to hurt the most because I put trust in them. So I know that trust is important. And maybe you're thinking, what I don't know is, what do you do when trust is broken? What do you do when there's failure? What do you do when you counted on them and they didn't come through and it hurt? And again, Paul, Barnabas, John Mark's story, so insightful. Because we don't know how, again, it happened, but we do know that somehow they rebuilt trust. That somehow things got reconciled because Paul, at the end of his life, he knows the end is close by. He says this in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He says this, get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in my ministry. Look, I'm at the end. I know things are going to close in on me. I know I'm about to be done. And you know what I really want? I really want Mark to be here with me. He's so helpful to me. The guy that I thought was a quitter, the guy that I felt like had broken trust with me, I want him here. I need him here. And not only that, but if you continue to read throughout Paul's letters, he talks about how valuable Barnabas was to him. He talks about how important the things that Barnabas was doing was to the work of the church and ministry. So somehow, some way, these relationships, they got rebuilt. But it doesn't tell us how. But the good news is, the Bible does tell us how. As a matter of fact, it tells us how over and over and over and over. It is one of the constant themes of the Bible of how do you rebuild trust. It shows up over and over and over and over again. You may not think of it that way, and you may not have understood it to be the key to rebuilding trust, but it is. But before we talk about that, I want to tell you about a law that goes along with these bonds. If you were with us last week, we talked about these bonds, and these bonds are the things that help us maintain and enjoy healthy relationships. And we spent a lot of time talking about know last week. How do I know somebody? And one of the things we said was there is a law that goes along with this bond of knowing another person, that it's not always anybody's fault, and it doesn't mean anybody has done anything wrong, but that this kind of leaks like a tire with a slow leak. And if we don't do anything about it, it leaks down, and then it starts to pull all of these other sliders down too. These are like remote controls, like your volume up, volume down. You control it in the relationship. But if the know, how much I know somebody, continues to leak down and nothing changes, I find myself in a relationship, sometimes a long-term relationship, going, I don't even feel like I know you anymore because it leaked and nobody did anything about it. So we talked a lot about that law of slow leaks. But today I want to talk to you about a different law, the law of the safe zone. The law of the safe zone, because here's why you need to know this. This is not a guarantee, so don't hear it that way. But this greatly reduces the potential of your relationship suffering from broken trust. There are no guarantees. There are absolutely no guarantees. But you can reduce the likelihood of being in a relationship that breaks trust and breaks you up. And you can do that by simply following this law. And actually introduced it to you last week too. The law of the safe zone is very simple. These bonds are in order. First, I know somebody. Then I learn how much I should trust them. Then that helps me to understand if I should rely or how much I should rely on them. Once I know and trust and rely, it gives me insight into what kind of commitment to make. And then finally, what kind of touch is appropriate for the relationship. Here's the law of the safe zone. Your slider should never be higher than the slider on the left. Should never be higher. So, for example, right here, and this makes so much sense. I don't know this person really very well at all, but I really trust them. Does that sound wise? I mean, nobody would argue that that's a good idea. And that's what this law is. In essence, I should know somebody, say at a level of 7 or 8, then I'm probably going to trust them up to like 5, 6, or 7. Like, I want to make sure that my trust level is a little bit lower than my know level. And this works all the way across the board. It makes sense for each bond. They play off of each other. And the law of the safe zone simply says, if I keep the slider on the right a little lower than the slider on the left, I'm setting myself up to be successful, for this relationship to be healthy, for me to win and for them to win, for it to be helpful and encouraging for both of us. Talk about a friendship. Get to know somebody. They're a good friend. I enjoy being around them. I'm going to trust them. Not up here, because I don't know them that well. I'm going to trust them somewhere around here. And yeah, you know what? As I know and make decisions about how to trust, I should probably start to rely on them, and they can rely on me. Like, we kind of have this connection where we're going to be there for each other. Not up here, because I don't know them that well, and I'm not sure if I trust them that much just yet, but maybe down here. And since we know and trust and rely on each other, we make commitments like, you're going to be my best friend, or you're my 2 a.m. friend. Like, when nothing's going right and I need to talk to somebody at 2 in the morning, you're my 2 a.m. friend. That's my commitment. And then even touch. And well, what does that have to do with anything? There's appropriate levels of touch, right? You don't know somebody, they're a complete stranger, maybe a handshake. That's about it. It gets weird after that, doesn't it? Like, am I the only one that it gets? You know somebody fairly well, maybe a slap on the back or an arm around the shoulder or something like that. I mean, it changes based on how well you know each other, and that makes complete sense. It makes even more sense in romantic relationships. Did this last week, but I think it's worth repeating. What if you flip this? What if you say, you know what? I just met this person. I really like them. I think they're amazing, and they seem to be into me. And you know what? We just enjoy being to each other, and we're attracted to each other. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves, we're really touching and being intimate in the way we touch each other. Now, we don't really have any kind of commitment to each other. We don't know each other very well. We've only known each other a week or two. And but I do trust them because I like them so much. And I'm sure that one day we're going to get married, or we're going to have a life together, or we're going to, whatever. And I'm not saying that it's a guaranteed disaster, but I'm telling you, if you want to lower the likelihood of a broken trust ruining a relationship, this is how you do it. You get these things out of order, and all of a sudden the relationship has a huge potential for failure. This is the law of the safe zone. Stay a little lower than the slider to the right. It will help you win at your relationships. Now, and this is what I love about this. This is Dr. John Van Epps' work. What I love about this is it is so straightforward. You could actually teach this to somebody else, couldn't you? And that's my challenge to you. Teach this to your people. Teach this to your friends. Teach this to your family. Teach this to your kids or your grandkids. They need to know this. And you know how I know why? Because of what we talked about a few weeks ago, that loneliness is through the roof, that divorce rates are huge, that people are walking around broken and hurt and mistrustful of everyone. You know why? Because we're not building relationships the way God designed us to, and it's killing us relationally. And part of the reason why is nobody's ever taken the time to show people what God's design is for relationships. So you could do this on a napkin or a piece of paper. Show somebody this whole idea of the safe zone, because it completely reduces the chances of broken trust ruining your relationship. And that's so, so important. Because as we've said over and over and over, and we'll keep saying over and over and over, the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives. That's how it works. Great relationships, life's going really good. Terrible relationships, doesn't matter about your job, how much money you have, or any of those other things, your life is not going well. Relationships are that huge, huge indicator. But what about broken trust? So this is great. If I put this in place, and for future relationships, I can kind of work this model and follow God's design for relationships and find myself winning. But what about the ones where we're already losing? How do you rebuild trust? Because I know this about some of you. Some of you kind of given up on it. And I just want to tell you, be careful. Be careful about giving up the idea of rebuilding trust with your spouse. Be careful about giving up the idea of rebuilding trust with your son that keeps making decisions that seem like they disappoint you every time. Be careful about making that decision that you can't rebuild trust with your daughter who's living a life that's completely different than the one you want her to. Be careful thinking you can never rebuild that relationship with your dad because he just seems so set in his ways. Be careful. Be careful. Because it is possible. Now again, there's no guarantee, but it is absolutely possible to rebuild a relationship. And what that looks like is difficult. It's not a guarantee, and it is difficult. And I'll just tell you that right up front. There are ways to start the process. What it does is it opens a door to the possibility. It does not guarantee the outcome. And you know why, because there's more than one person involved. You can't control what the other person does, but you can control what you do. You can open the door. And I hope to convince you here in just a moment why you need to open the door. So what is this thing? What is this thing that the Bible talks about that is constantly used to rebuild trust and rebuild relationships that comes up over and over and over? It's forgiveness. Forgiveness unlocks the potential to rebuild trust. Forgiveness is the thing that makes the difference. And it opens the door. And as soon as I said that, some of you who are in a very raw place right now, some of you are in a relationship that the trust was broken and it was devastating and was hurtful and you're angry and you're sad and you're frustrated and you're just clouded by emotions, you start pushing back and say, no, you don't understand. And you know what? You're right, I don't. I don't know what happened. I don't know how it got to the place it did. I don't know why it hit you and hurt you and did what it did. I don't claim to know that. I do know this, that forgiveness is incredibly important for you. It's incredibly important for your future relationships. And it's incredibly important for that single relationship where you need to at least open the door to rebuilding. And here's why. You may have never thought of this. When you choose not to forgive someone, think about this. What's happening? Usually, there's some bitterness. Usually, there's some sadness, some anger. And usually, there is, again, you've chosen not to forgive, so there's an unwillingness to forgive. Let me ask you this question. How good have your relationships been with other people when they're bitter, angry, and unwilling to forgive, even if it doesn't involve you? It's usually not very good. Because you're bringing that stuff with you into every relationship that you have. When you choose to not forgive, you're bringing the bitterness, you're bringing the sadness, you're bringing the hurt, you're bringing the mistrust, all of that into every other relationship that you have because that's part of you. You see, this is why forgiveness is so important, even though it is incredibly difficult. Because the emotions that it stirs up, it's emotional, and emotions always create a little bit of a mist and a fog. So let's kind of try to demystify it just a little bit. Again, I'm not telling you that this is step 1, 2, 3, this is easy and it's no big deal. Because I have relationships in my life that are hard and hurtful just like you do. And I know that there's no simple 3-step plan. But here's what I do know. That forgiveness can be demystified and it can open the door. And the first thing you have to understand is that forgiveness is a decision. It's a decision that you make. The way I know this is because of what Jesus did. Those of you that are followers of Jesus, you know the story of him being crucified on the cross. And he said a few things when that was happening. But one of the things he said, literally, as somebody is executing him, he says, Father, forgive them. Because they don't know what they're doing. I can guarantee you, he didn't feel like it. He didn't feel like it physically. He didn't feel like it emotionally. He may not have felt like it even spiritually. But he made the decision. And you might think, oh, that's cool. You know, I love that about Jesus, and I love that story about Jesus. And you know what? He's done the same for you. Because every time you have broken trust with God, every time you have failed God, every time you have hurt God, every time you've broken trust with him, you know what he said? Father, forgive them. Forgive Brett. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know the implications of what he was doing. He didn't know how hurtful this was going to be. He didn't know how this was going to mess up things. So Father, please forgive him. He didn't know. He does the same for you. And so we have this model in Jesus, if we consider ourselves followers of Jesus, that he's making a decision to forgive. Not because it's easy, not because it feels good, not because he wants to, but he's making a decision because he knows how important it is. It becomes a model for us. Yes, it hurt when she did that. Yes, it hurt when he said that. Yes, I can't believe they made that decision and how it hit us and hit our family and how it changed everything and how terrible. I'm going to make a decision to forgive them, which rolls right into the next thing that kind of helps demystify it. Forgiveness is a journey. See, I don't know whoever came up with the idea that you haven't forgiven somebody unless you forget what happened. That's wrong. I don't know whose idea that was. It's not right. It's not true. You don't forget. That doesn't make any sense. How are you going to forget something that was incredibly hurtful? And here's what I also know about this journey of forgiveness. The deeper the hurt, the longer it takes. It doesn't happen in a minute. Yes, you make a decision in a moment, but it doesn't mean everything is done. It is a journey. And here's what I have discovered in my own life, and maybe many of you have too. When you really have to work hard at forgiving someone because of what happened, it is an ongoing thing, and you have to forgive them several times. It would be nice if you could just get there and that one day you kind of like, okay, at 10 o'clock I forgave them, and woohoo, good to go now. Doesn't work like that. Because a picture, a song, a memory, a word, a smell, seeing them again stirs it all up all over again. And you have to make the decision to forgive them. And then you have to put it in motion. It is a journey. And again, a lot of people get really confused. Forgiveness, it's so hard. I don't want to admit that what they did was okay, and I don't want them to think it was right. It's none of those things. Forgiveness is actually a financial term. And if you want to think of it this way, you owed me $5,000, and I said, you know what? You're not obligated anymore. You don't have to pay it back. That's what forgiveness is. There's no emotion involved at all. Doesn't mean what happened wasn't emotional, but it is a transaction. You did something. You betrayed my trust. You hurt me. You disappointed me. You actually lied to me. And in that sense, you owe me better than that. But I've decided you don't have to pay that back. And you can see why this is a process. You can see why this is a journey. It takes a little bit of time to get there. Forgiveness, it is a decision. Forgiveness is an ongoing journey, but here's the really good news. Forgiveness has a destination. It does have a destination. It does land. And how do you know? How do you know when you've gotten to that place where forgiveness is real? It's very simple. When you no longer want to bring it up, when you no longer feel a need to bring it up, you know you've turned a corner. You know that you're making progress. And it doesn't mean you'll never have to make that decision again. It doesn't mean you'll never have to go through that journey a little bit. It just means you have turned a corner, and you can take the energy, which it does, it takes energy. You can take the energy that you were investing in getting to that place where you could forgive, and now you can reorient it towards getting to know them again, deciding what trust looks like in that relationship again, and what it might mean to rely or commit, and what other bonds would be present in that relationship. And I know some of you, you're hearing this and you're just like, yeah, but you don't get, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. Listen, again, the last thing I would share with you about forgiveness is this. Jesus commands us to forgive. So if you're a follower of his, there's not a lot of wiggle room here, okay? Jesus does not command us to trust. Those are two different things. As a matter of fact, it would be foolish to keep trusting somebody who, as you continue to know them, they keep turning up untrustworthy. Doesn't make any sense. What this does when you forgive is it gives you the mental space, the emotional space, the spiritual space to say, I'm going to get to know this person, or I can try to get to know this person again. And there's a potential that this relationship could be rebuilt. And as I get to know them, it helps me make a decision about what trust may or may not look like. And if I get to know them, and one of the things that's obvious is this person is not in a place where it makes sense to trust them anymore, or to trust them at a high level. You still have given yourself the ability, the potential to rebuild a relationship, but you're acting according to God's design, and you're realizing that this gives me the information I need to make this decision, and maybe after the broken relationship gets rebuilt, after forgiveness has happened, we can get to know each other a little bit better, and we find out that it is worth trusting them some more. And we stay in the safe zone. And all of a sudden, like Paul and Mark, we find the relationship is rebuilt. We find that there's value there. It doesn't always work out that way. There are no guarantees. But this gives you the potential for that. You see, again, if you're a follower of Jesus, the resurrection changed you. God forgave you. Jesus asked for you to be forgiven because you didn't know what you were doing. He gave you a brand new life. And then he tells us, look, you forgive because you've been forgiven. Not because they deserve it. Not because what they did was right somehow or that it's justifiable or any of those other things. But because you've been forgiven. You forgive. Be like your Father. And we forgive because we're forgiven. And God tells us and shows us in so many different ways what we've already talked about, that our relationships, they determine the quality of our life. And we forgive because Jesus commands it, because it frees us, and because we don't want to take that bitterness, that ugliness, that unforgiveness, that sadness, that anger into all my other relationships with me. And forgiveness gives me the potential to rebuild. And it allows me to move into the other relationships I have in a much healthier space. See, sometimes people hear this and they think, well, that means I'm just never going to trust anybody again. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to get hurt again. I don't want that to happen again. No. You're designed for relationships. Just do it in order and it becomes so much clearer. Make sure that you know them better than you trust them. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't mean don't trust. It means get to know before you trust. So we're going to do that with God. We're going to keep getting to know God. We're going to keep reading his word. We're going to keep praying. We're going to keep connecting with him. We're going to keep learning from Jesus. And because we know him better, we're going to trust him more and our lives are going to change. And then in our human relationships, we're going to move at the speed of trust. We're going to move at the speed of trust. So if trust is here, we're going to let everything play off of that. If trust is up here, then it all changes. If trust is way down here, then we know there's some work to do. There's some decisions to make. That's how you win at relationships. First, in your relationship with God, which is so important. And second, in your relationships with each other. I hope that you will forgive. I hope that you will begin that journey. And I will also tell you just from personal experience, it's incredibly difficult. But it's also incredibly valuable. It changes you. And it changes your other relationships, even though they didn't have anything to do with what happened. It is worth it. So move at the speed of trust. Let's pray together. Father, we didn't know you, but you loved us. We didn't deserve forgiveness, but you gave it to us. You gave us new life through a new relationship with you when we weren't trustworthy. You made a commitment to us to love us when we weren't deserving of a commitment. And Father, in that we see how good you really are, how deeply you love. And Father, it inspires us. We see it in Jesus' example of forgiveness. We see it in his wisdom and his teaching and how he loved people and how he loves us. Father, I pray for every person here that you'd give us the courage to know you, not what everybody else says, not what our feelings tell us, but who you really are. And Father, unfortunately, probably every one of us knows the heartbreak of being lied to, of broken trust, of being disappointed, of feeling left out. And while we hear these words about forgiveness, it can be so difficult. Father, would you help us? You said last week in your word that you would give us the desire and the power. Father, I pray that you'd give us the desire and the power to be a forgiver. And as your eyes are closed and your head is bowed, I want you to take a moment and talk to your Father right now. If there's a relationship that needs forgiveness, would you talk to your Father about it? Would you ask him for the help that you need? He wants to help you. You say, I can't do it on my own. And he says, I know, I'll give you the strength you need. Ask God to help you forgive, to help you stay in the journey and get to the destination. Father, you know our hearts, you know our relationships, and you know what we need. I pray that you'd bring it to us today. Help us to know and trust you and learn how to know and trust the people in our lives. We love you. We thank you. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.